In a quiet corner of Eastern Europe, long before the thunder of artillery and the chaos of war would define her life, a young woman named Lyudmila Pavlichenko was simply a student with an unusual hobby. Born in 1916, she grew up in a time when the world was still recovering from one global conflict, unaware that an even greater one was looming on the horizon. Her early years were not marked by war, but by curiosity, discipline, and a determination to prove herself in a society that often underestimated women. As a teenager, she moved with her family to Kiev, a city that would shape her future in unexpected ways. Like many young people, she balanced school with work, taking a job at a factory while continuing her education. But unlike most of her peers, Lyudmila found herself drawn to something far less ordinary: marksmanship. At a time when shooting clubs were often dominated by men, she joined one not just out of interest, but out of defiance. She refused to accept the idea that skill with a rifle was reserved for anyone but her. What began as a challenge quickly became a passion. She trained relentlessly, learning to control her breathing, steady her hands, and sharpen her focus. Every shot was a test of patience and precision. Targets at a distance became less intimidating with each passing day. In those quiet practice sessions, she was unknowingly building the foundation for a future that would place her among the deadliest snipers in history. By the time she enrolled at Kiev University, where she studied history, her life seemed set on a predictable path. She was intelligent, disciplined, and ambitious. A career in academia or research seemed likely, yet history, the very subject she studied, had other plans for her. In 1941, the course of her life and the lives of millions changed forever with the eruption of World War II on the Eastern Front. When Nazi Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union, the shockwaves were immediate and devastating. Cities were bombed, defenses were overwhelmed, and entire populations were thrown into chaos. For Lyudmila, this was not just a distant political event, it was a direct threat to her home, her family, and everything she knew. The world she had carefully built was suddenly at risk of disappearing. Faced with this reality, she made a decision that would define her legacy. While many hesitated or sought safety, Lyudmila stepped forward. She went to a recruitment office and volunteered for the Red Army. At first, like many women at the time, she was offered a role as a nurse. It was considered more appropriate, safer, and more aligned with societal expectations, but Lyudmila refused. She insisted on being sent to the front lines as a combat soldier. This was not a simple request. It was a challenge to deeply ingrained norms. Yet she had something few could argue against: proof of her skill. Armed with her marksmanship certificates and unwavering determination, she convinced the authorities that she belonged not behind the lines, but on them. Eventually, she was accepted into the infantry as a sniper. Training was intense, but for Lyudmila, it was also familiar territory. The rifle was no longer just a tool, it was an extension of her will. She learned military tactics, fieldcraft, and survival skills. She practiced moving unseen, blending into her surroundings, and waiting for hours without movement. Every lesson reinforced a single truth: a sniper's greatest weapon is not just accuracy, but patience. Soon, training gave way to reality. She was deployed to the front, where the abstract idea of war became brutally tangible. The sounds were overwhelming: gunfire, explosions, shouted commands. The air carried the smell of smoke and earth torn apart by shells. This was no shooting range. This was survival. Her first days on the battlefield were a test not just of skill, but of resolve. It is one thing to aim at a target made of paper or metal. It is another to face a living enemy, knowing that hesitation could mean death, not just for her, but for her comrades. Many soldiers faltered in these moments. Some never recovered from the psychological weight of taking a life.
For Lyudmila, the transition was not easy, but it was decisive. Guided by her training and driven by a fierce sense of duty, she adapted quickly. Her focus narrowed, her breathing steadied, and her movements became calculated. Each decision was deliberate, each shot carried consequence. In those early encounters, something remarkable began to emerge. She was not just surviving, she was excelling. Her ability to remain calm under pressure set her apart. While chaos unfolded around her, she maintained clarity. While others reacted, she anticipated. It was this mindset that would soon make her one of the most effective snipers on the battlefield. But beyond the growing tally of her successes, there was something deeper at work. Lyudmila was redefining what was possible. In a war dominated by men, she was proving that skill, courage, and determination were not bound by gender. Every mission she completed, every challenge she overcame, chipped away at the doubts of those who had underestimated her. Yet, as her reputation began to grow, the war itself showed no signs of slowing down. The front lines shifted constantly, and danger was ever present. Each day brought new threats, new missions, and new tests of endurance. The student who once studied history in a classroom was now living it in its most brutal form. What makes this transformation so compelling is not just the outcome, but the speed at which it happened. In a matter of months, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had gone from a university student to a soldier facing one of the most formidable military forces in the world, and she was only getting started. The quiet determination that once drove her to prove herself at a shooting range was now being tested on a global stage. The discipline she cultivated in peacetime was becoming a weapon in wartime, and the young woman who refused to accept limitations was about to become a legend whose name would echo far beyond the battlefield. As the war intensified, so too would her journey, one marked by precision, resilience, and a level of skill that would leave even her enemies in disbelief.
The battlefield does not wait for anyone to be ready. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko first stepped into active combat, there was no gradual adjustment, no safe distance from danger. The war demanded immediate action, and every second carried weight. The sounds of artillery and gunfire were constant, echoing across the shattered landscape as if the earth itself was breaking apart. For a new sniper, this was the moment where training either held firm or collapsed entirely. Her unit was positioned near Odessa, one of the first major fronts where Soviet forces clashed intensely with advancing German troops during World War II. The conditions were harsh, unpredictable, and unforgiving. Trenches carved into the Zemu offered little protection, and visibility could shift in an instant. Every ruined building, every patch of grass, every shadow could conceal an enemy. At first, Lyudmila was not immediately handed the role she had fought for. Like many newcomers, she had to prove herself under real combat conditions. There was skepticism around her, not necessarily because she lacked skill, but because few believed a young woman could endure the psychological strain of sniper warfare. It was one thing to hit targets in training, it was another to do it while being hunted. Her first opportunity came suddenly. An enemy soldier appeared within range, moving cautiously, unaware that he had already been seen. Lyudmila took position, her rifle steady, her breathing controlled. In that moment, everything slowed. The chaos of the battlefield faded into the background. There was only the target, the distance, and the decision. But this was different from anything she had experienced before. This was not practice, this was irreversible. For a brief moment, hesitation crept in. It was a natural reaction, the human mind resisting the reality of what came next. Around her, more experienced soldiers watched closely. They understood this moment well. Many had failed it, some never recovered from it. Then, quietly but firmly, someone beside her spoke.
Not an order, but a reminder. If she did not act, the enemy would. That was enough. She adjusted her aim, exhaled slowly, and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and final. The enemy soldier fell. There was no celebration, no dramatic reaction, just silence and a shift within her. In that instant, Lyudmila crossed an invisible line. The hesitation was gone, replaced by clarity. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. That first confirmed kill changed everything. It was not about pride or numbers. It was about survival. From that moment on, every decision became more focused, more deliberate. The battlefield no longer felt overwhelming. It became something she could read, understand, and navigate. As the days turned into weeks, her confidence grew. She began to see patterns in enemy movement, predict positions, and anticipate actions. Where others saw chaos, she began to see structure. This ability allowed her to act faster, think clearer, and remain one step ahead. But sniper warfare was not just about skill, it was a psychological battle. The enemy was not passive. German forces were highly trained, and their own snipers were among the best in the world. Each side was constantly searching for the other, studying terrain, watching for the smallest sign of movement. A misplaced step, a reflection of light, even the slightest sound could reveal a position, and that mistake would be fatal. Lyudmila quickly learned that patience was her greatest weapon. Hours could pass without a single shot. She would lie perfectly still, blending into the environment, her body pressed against the zemu, her eyes scanning endlessly. Insects crawled across her skin, the sun beat down relentlessly, and exhaustion crept in, but she did not move. Because the moment she did, she could die. These long periods of stillness were broken by seconds of action. A target would appear, often briefly, and she had to be ready. There was no time to think twice. Her movements became instinctive. Identify, aim, breathe, fire. Each successful shot reinforced her discipline. Word of her effectiveness began to spread within her unit. At first, it was quiet, whispers among soldiers who had witnessed her precision. Then it became undeniable. She was not just capable, she was exceptional. Yet, with success came increased danger. The more effective she became, the more attention she attracted. Enemy forces began to realize they were facing a skilled sniper. They responded by deploying their own marksmen specifically to hunt her. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were patient, experienced, and deadly. This marked the beginning of a new phase in her journey, sniper versus sniper. Unlike regular combat, these encounters were slow, tense, and deeply psychological. Two individuals, often separated by hundreds of meters, would engage in a silent duel that could last hours, even days. Neither could afford to make the first mistake. In these moments, the battlefield became a test of nerves. Lyudmila had to remain completely still, observing through her scope, searching for the smallest anomaly, a flicker of movement, an unnatural shape, a shadow that didn't belong. Her opponent was doing the same. It was not just about shooting, it was about outthinking the enemy. Despite the danger, she adapted quickly. Her earlier experiences in the shooting club, her discipline, and her growing combat instincts all came together. She learned how to set traps, how to mislead enemy snipers, and how to use the terrain to her advantage. Each encounter sharpened her abilities further. But the psychological toll was always present. The constant awareness that someone, somewhere, was watching her through a scope created a pressure that few could tolerate. Sleep was never fully restful. Every movement carried risk. Trust in her own instincts became essential. Still, she endured. By the end of her first months in combat, Lyudmila was no longer seen as a newcomer. She had proven herself in the most demanding way possible. Her kill count steadily increased, but more importantly, her reputation solidified. She was becoming a key asset to her unit, a sniper who could be relied upon in critical moments. What made her stand out was not just accuracy, but consistency. She didn't take reckless shots. She waited. She chose her moments carefully. This approach not only increased her effectiveness, but also ensured her survival in an environment where mistakes were rarely forgiven. The transformation was undeniable. The young woman who once hesitated before her first shot was now a disciplined and focused sniper, capable of operating under extreme pressure. The battlefield that once seemed overwhelming had become something she could control. Yet, this was only the beginning. The challenges ahead would grow more complex, the enemies more skilled, and the stakes even higher. What she had learned so far would be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. And it was in those coming moments that she would develop the tactics, the so-called insane trick, that would set her apart from nearly every sniper of her time.
By the time Lyudmila Pavlichenko had established herself as a reliable and deadly sniper, the battlefield had already begun to change around her. She was no longer just another soldier trying to survive. She had become a target. Enemy forces were now aware that somewhere in their khutut, a highly skilled sniper was eliminating their troops with unsettling precision. And when that realization spreads, the response is inevitable. They send their best to stop you. This was the moment where ordinary marksmanship was no longer enough. What separated survival from death was not just accuracy, but intelligence, creativity, and the ability to think like the enemy. It was here that Lyudmila began to develop the tactics that many would later describe as almost unbelievable, not because they were impossible, but because of how effectively she executed them under constant danger. Sniper warfare, at its core, is a game of patience. But against German snipers during World War II, patience alone would not guarantee victory. These were professionals, often with years of experience. They knew how to hide, how to wait, and most importantly, how to bait their opponents into making fatal mistakes. So Lyudmila adapted. One of her most effective methods involved deception, turning the enemy's expectations against them. Instead of remaining completely invisible at all times, she would sometimes create controlled signs of presence, a slight movement in a bush, a subtle shift in a piece of cloth, or even a deliberately exposed position, just enough to attract attention, but not enough to reveal her true location. To an inexperienced eye, these details might go unnoticed, but to a trained sniper, they were impossible to ignore. The enemy would watch, wait, and eventually take the bait. The moment they reacted, whether by adjusting position, shifting their scope, or preparing to fire, they revealed themselves, and that was all Lyudmila needed. Her real position, carefully concealed at a distance, gave her the advantage. She was not reacting, she was anticipating. This tactic required extraordinary discipline. It meant resisting the instinct to fire immediately and instead allowing the enemy to believe they had the upper hand. It meant thinking several steps ahead, predicting behavior, and setting a trap that could take hours or even days to unfold. In one particularly intense encounter, she faced a German sniper who refused to be deceived easily. Both remained hidden, observing, waiting for the other to make the first mistake. Hours passed with no movement. The sun shifted across the sky, shadows changed, and still neither acted. Most soldiers would have grown restless. Fatigue would set in, focus would slip, but not Lyudmila. She understood that this was not just a physical battle, it was psychological. The first to lose patience would lose everything. So she remained perfectly still, controlling her breathing, conserving her energy, and watching for the smallest inconsistency in the landscape. Eventually, it came. A nearly invisible flicker,
A slight reflection, perhaps, from a scope lens catching the light for just a fraction of a second. It was the kind of detail most would miss, but she had trained herself to notice the unnatural, the out of place. Without hesitation, she adjusted her aim and fired. The duel was over. These encounters became a defining part of her experience. Each one sharpened her instincts, forcing her to refine her methods. She learned to read terrain like a map of possibilities. Every irtifa, every shadow, every resolution a structure offering both risk and opportunity. Camouflage became an art form. She blended into her surroundings so completely that even experienced observers struggled to detect her. Mud, foliage, fabric, anything that could break the outline of her form was used. She understood that the human eye searches for patterns, for shapes it recognizes. By eliminating those patterns, she became almost invisible. But perhaps her greatest strength was not her ability to hide, it was her ability to think. She studied her enemies, not just as targets, but as individuals making decisions. Where would they position themselves? What would they prioritize? How would they react under pressure? By answering these questions, she turned every engagement into a calculated encounter rather than a random exchange. This mindset gave rise to what many later described as her insane trick, not a single tactic, but a combination of deception, patience, and psychological manipulation. She did not simply wait for opportunities, she created them, and the results spoke for themselves. Her kill count continued to rise, but more importantly, her efficiency improved. She wasted no shots. Every action had purpose. Every movement was calculated. This level of precision made her one of the most feared snipers on the front. Yet, with each success, the khatar increased. Enemy forces became more cautious. They began deploying sniper pairs, using spotters, and coordinating movements to counter her tactics. The battlefield evolved into a complex web of observation and counter-observation, where every taraf was constantly adapting. But Lyudmila adapted faster. She changed positions frequently, avoided predictable patterns, and used the environment to remain one step ahead. Her understanding that survival depended on unpredictability was key to her continued effectiveness. The moment she became predictable, she would become vulnerable. Despite the constant danger, she maintained an almost unshakable composure. Fear was always present, it had to be, but she did not allow it to control her actions. Instead, she used it to sharpen her focus, to heighten her awareness. In many ways, this was the true test of a sniper, not the ability to shoot, but the ability to remain calm while being hunted. By this stage of the war, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was no longer just a soldier fulfilling her duty. She had become a master of her craft, operating on a level that few could match. Her methods were studied, her movements respected, and her presence feared. And yet, even as her legend grew, the war itself showed no mercy. The battles ahead would push her even further, to her limits and beyond. The numbers would continue to rise, the muwajahat would become more dangerous, and the cost of every decision would grow heavier. But it was precisely these moments, shaped by strategy and survival, that would lead her to achieve what few thought possible.
By the time Lyudmila Pavlichenko reached the height of her effectiveness, the war around her had intensified into something even more brutal and unforgiving. The fighting had shifted to one of the most fiercely contested Manatik of the Eastern Front, Sevastopol. This city, heavily fortified and strategically vital, became the stage where her skills would be tested to their absolute limits during World War II. Sevastopol was not just another battlefield, it was a siege, long, exhausting, and relentless. Artillery fire rained down day and night, reducing buildings to rubble and turning the landscape into a maze of razrushenia. Every position was contested, every advance costly.
For a sniper, however, this environment offered both danger and opportunity. The razrushene structures, shattered walls, and gluboke craters created countless hiding places, but also just as many threats. It was here that Lyudmila's abilities reached their peak. Her role became increasingly critical. Infantry units relied on her to eliminate key Dushman targets, officers, machine gunners, and, most importantly, enemy snipers. Each successful shot did more than remove a single soldier. It disrupted coordination, lowered morale, and created openings for her comrades. In a battle where every advantage mattered, her precision became a force multiplier. Day after day, she operated under conditions that pushed human endurance to its limits. Sleep was scarce, food was limited, and the constant stress weighed heavily on every soldier. Yet she remained focused. Her routine, if it could even be called that, revolved around observation, patience, and calculated action. By this stage, her reputation had spread far beyond her immediate unit. Stories of her effectiveness circulated among Soviet Kuwait, turning her into a symbol of resilience and kudrat. But reputation in war is a double-edged sword. While it inspired allies, it also attracted increased attention from the enemy. German forces were well aware of the khatar she posed. Reports of a highly skilled sniper with an unusually high number of confirmed kills led them to prioritize her elimination. Specialized sniper teams were deployed with a single objective: find her and stop her. This only made her work more dangerous. Encounters with enemy snipers became more frequent and more intense. These were no longer isolated duels, they were calculated hunts. Both sides understood the stakes. A single mistake could end everything. Despite this, Lyudmila continued to succeed. Her kill count steadily climbed, each confirmed shot bringing her closer to a number that would become almost legendary: 309. But this number, often repeated, does not fully capture what it represented. It was not just a measure of accuracy, it was a reflection of consistency under extreme pressure, of survival in an environment where countless others did not. Reaching such a figure required more than skill. It required endurance, discipline, and an ability to function despite constant danger. Every one of those 309 engagements carried risk. Every one demanded focus, and every one contributed to the growing legend surrounding her name. At the same time, her presence began to play a significant role beyond direct combat. Soviet leadership recognized the value of her story. In a war that demanded not only physical strength, but also psychological resilience, figures like Lyudmila became symbols. Her success challenged expectations, demonstrating that courage and capability were not limited by gender. Reports about her achievements were shared to boost morale among troops and civilians alike. She became an example of what determination could achieve even in the darkest circumstances. For soldiers on the front lines, knowing that someone like her was fighting alongside them provided a sense of confidence. For those far from the battlefield, her story offered hope. But while others saw the legend, Lyudmila remained in the reality of war. The pressure did not disappear. If anything, it increased. Expectations grew, missions became more demanding, and the khatar never faded. The line between success and failure remained razor-thin. Then, in the midst of this relentless sangharsh, everything changed. During one of the amaliyat near Sevastopol, Lyudmila was wounded. The details of the moment were sudden and chaotic, like so many ahdath in war. Whether from mortar fire or shrapnel, the result was the same. She could no longer remain on the front lines. For a sniper who had spent months in constant action, this was a turning point. She was evacuated from the battlefield, removed from the environment where she had proven herself time and again. The war continued, but her role within it was about to shift dramatically. By the time she left active combat, her record stood as one of the most remarkable in military history. 309 confirmed kills, including dozens of enemy snipers, each one representing a battle of patience, precision, and survival. But numbers alone do not define her impact. What truly set her apart was how she achieved them. In one of the most intense theaters of World War II, under constant threat, she maintained a level of effectiveness that few could match. She adapted, evolved, and endured. And yet, her story was far from over. Leaving the battlefield did not mean leaving the war. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would take her far beyond the front lines, into a different kind of arena, where her voice, her experience, and her legend would carry a different kind of power. The sniper who had once operated in silence was about to be heard by the world. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko was pulled from the front lines after being wounded, it marked the end of one chapter, but not the end of her role in World War II. For months, she had lived in silence, hidden among ruins and shadows, communicating through actions rather than words. Now, for the first time since the war began, her voice would become her most powerful weapon. The Soviet leadership quickly understood that Lyudmila was more than a soldier. She was a symbol. Her record, her discipline, and her story carried a weight that extended far beyond the battlefield. At a time when the war demanded not only military strength, but also international support, figures like her could influence public perception in ways that bullets could not. In 1942, she was sent on a diplomatic mission to the United States, a journey that would place her in a completely different kind of spotlight. For someone who had spent months lying motionless in camouflage, the transition was almost surreal. Instead of ruined cities and constant danger, she found herself in crowded halls, formal events, and rooms filled with journalists. But the pressure did not disappear, it simply changed form. She was now expected to represent her country, to speak about the realities of war, and to connect with audiences who had never experienced anything like the Eastern Front. Many in the West were still distant from the true scale of the conflict. For them, war was something read about in newspapers. For Lyudmila, it was something she had lived every single day. During her visit, she met influential figures, including Franklin D. Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. These meetings were not just ceremonial, they were strategic. The Soviet Union sought stronger support from its allies, and Lyudmila's presence helped humanize the arm in a way that statistics and reports could not. Yet not all attention was respectful. At press conferences, some journalists focused less on her achievements and more on trivial aspects, her appearance, her clothing, even her personal life. Questions that ignored the reality of her experience were common. For someone who had faced death countless times, these moments revealed a different kind of challenge, being misunderstood. But Lyudmila did not remain silent. In one of her most famous responses, she addressed the audience directly, her words cutting through the superficial curiosity. She reminded them that she was a soldier, not a spectacle, that while they asked about fashion, people were dying, that the war was not distant, it was real, immediate, and devastating. Her message was clear, and it resonated. Audiences began to see her not just as a curiosity, but as a witness to one of the most brutal fronts of the war. Her calm, direct manner carried the weight of experience. She did not exaggerate, she did not dramatize, she simply spoke the truth as she had lived it. This authenticity made her powerful. She traveled across the United States, speaking to crowds, sharing her story, and building a connection between people separated by thousands of miles. In doing so, she helped strengthen the Soyuz between nations, reminding them of the shared stakes in the outcome of the war. But beyond diplomacy, her impact reached even further. Lyudmila Pavlichenko became a symbol of what women could achieve in roles traditionally denied to them. At a time when many still believed that combat was exclusively a male domain, her record stood as undeniable evidence to the contrary. She had not just participated, she had excelled at the highest level. Her story inspired countless others during and after the war. Women serving in various capacities saw in her an example of possibility. She showed that determination and skill could overcome expectation, that courage was not defined by gender. After her international tour, she returns to the Soviet Union, where she continued to serve in a different capacity. While she did not go back to frontline combat, her experience remained invaluable. She contributed to training, sharing the knowledge she had gained under the most extreme conditions. When the war finally ended, the world began the long process of rebuilding. For many soldiers, this transition was difficult. The habitual intensity of combat was replaced by a quieter, uncertain peace. For Lyudmila, the memories of the battlefield remained a permanent part of her life. Eventually, she returned to her studies, completing her education and working as a historian. In a way, she came full circle, from studying history to living it, and then back to preserving it. But her perspective was forever changed. The events she had witnessed, the decisions she had made, and the lives she had taken and saved could never be separated from who she had become. Over time, her name became legendary. Historians, military experts, and ordinary people continued to study her achievements. Her record of 309 confirmed kills remains one of the highest in history, but more importantly, it represents a level of discipline and resilience that few can truly understand. Yet what makes her story endure is not just the numbers, it is the journey. From a student in Kiev to one of the most effective snipers of World War II. It is the transformation shaped by necessity, the choices made under pressure, and the ability to adapt in the face of constant danger. It is also the reminder that history is not only shaped by large armies and powerful leaders, but by individuals, people who, in critical moments, choose to act. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was one of those people. Her legacy lives on not just in records or archives, but in the idea that even in the darkest times, determination and skill can leave a lasting mark. And while the war eventually ended, the story of the woman behind the rifle continues to echo, quiet, precise, and impossible to ignore.